You'll pay for what you did! You'll see! The high-pitched and highly strained voice of the young Sipperslang man rang out as he protested loudly and physically while being dragged away by security forces. Despite his relatively meagre size and build, it took 4 Lakshasets to really hold him secure, even though he was already rather battered from his first arrest. Admittedly, in the first second that the Sipperslang had suddenly come at him out of nowhere, while loudly shouting about presumed crimes he had committed against the galaxy, most of which hadn't really registered in his mind at the moment, James had, for only a moment, thought it had been Reprieg who was trying to attack him there. And his reaction had been correspondingly swift and, at least comparatively, extreme. It had, of course, barely taken a moment for him to completely lay the man out, and as soon as his brain had fired up again from the near automatic response, he had immediately seen that this was basically still a kid. And, more importantly, he actually looked nothing like Reprieg. His fur was way too dark and his trunk way too wide. That, and he still had both of his legs. Yet any guilty feelings he may have had about his perceived overreaction at first quickly dissipated, as the young man still kept ranting and raving on about how James was trying to poison people's minds with unnatural temptations, and how he, after that hadn't worked, was now trying to murder all of those who fought to keep the people's minds clean, so he would have free reign as soon as they were all gone. However, this young man was determined to not let him do that. And where had that determination gotten him? Flat on his ass. Though, admittedly, it took guts to just attack a human like that. Even more so a human soldier. And even more so if he wasn't alone. It was too bad those guts were putting their energy into the entirely wrong thing. With them being on both high alert and everyone's speed dial at this point, it hadn't taken long until the local security forces had arrived at their location to take the man away. Now, James, Admir and Coco stood back, as they watched him struggle against the restraints of the guards dragging him away. Originally, they would have offered their help with transporting him, as they saw how much the smaller, non-heavy gravity Deathworlder struggled with his resistance. However, by now they knew the ropes. This was far from the first sudden conflict they had to endure during the last couple of days, ever since every news organisation under any sun has started to publicly broadcast to everyone and their mother that this station had allegedly been attacked by the Human Miat Military Alliance, even though this was definitely one of the more brazen ones. At this point, it had become impossible for any of them to even step outside without at least 3 of the soldiers being present to keep the peace, and even then it sometimes failed, as had been so gloriously demonstrated here. So far, the attacks have been comparatively harmless, when considering who they were attacking. However, there was certainly no guarantee that it would stay like that. That wasn't to say, of course, that everyone on the station was entirely hostile towards them, or even that the majority was. It was really kind of hard to tell if that was the case or not. However, those that were certainly made themselves known far louder than those who possibly supported, or were even neutral towards them. It was a really lucky break that the people who most deeply believed in the community's core values weren't exactly in the habit of arming themselves, nor being very good with a weapon if they did. But how much longer until they would meet the exceptions? Just as he thought that, James's thoughts were suddenly pulled back into the moment by a familiar voice. "James, your shirt!" Moore exclaimed in a worried tone, reaching out one of her claws to point directly at him around the area of his clavicle. "Are you alright?" His heart beating mildly faster for a moment, James's gaze shot down to himself, then reached his mechanical hand up to slightly pull his shirt away from his chest to get a better look. Simultaneously, Admir and Coco also both turned to study him quickly. "Did he have a knife?" Admir asked, and took a step towards James to look more closely at what at first glance appeared to be a relatively clean cut through the fabric over his collarbone, revealing the pale skin underneath, and folding irregularly whenever James moved it. However, the skin underneath the damage was entirely unscathed. "Don't think so," James replied, briefly running his fingers over his skin to make entirely sure he wasn't just missing a wound somewhere. "I think his claw just got caught on it or something." All of them, but especially Moore, took a deep breath of relief. "Wanna go back and change?" Coca then offered, also coming up to him. However, James shook his head. "No, we're late already. Not like anyone cares about what I'm wearing," James replied. Right now, they were on their way to meet with Losaranaja and Losarano Emjor, the partial owner of the Fair Bingtaxa Hotel, and her son. After the attack on the detention center, and subsequent assassination of the representative Glororabal, the meeting of the Council of Primates had been put on ice for a uniform week, while the people involved were given some time to digest the events and plan ahead for how this would change the conference. Part of that was also figuring out exactly how they wanted to deal with the human situation, as the narrative that humanity was involved was obviously quite prevalent. Of course, nobody, or at least nobody who wasn't a complete idiot, was accusing James directly of being involved in the attack. However, the idea of allowing him to still openly represent humanity, even after the suspicion of his people assassinating another representative, previously arrested or not, was quite obviously hard to sell to many, even as humanity vehemently denied any accusations of being at all involved in the attack. The investigation so far has shown that both human and Miat individuals had most certainly been involved in the attack. They had been wearing at the very least convincingly authentic human and Miat military garb, and human and Miat military supplies and weaponry had been used in the attack. Searches and manhunts for any possible smuggling rings or thefts were of course running red hot at the moment. However, so far, no thread could be convincingly followed to a waterproof lead to the possible perpetrators. And that wasn't even mentioning when and how they had approached and or left the station. Of course, investigations had only been going on for a couple of days now, so it wasn't surprising that the first impressions of things was still the one that prevailed until further evidence could be discovered. But all of it still didn't throw any good light onto the high-class Deathworld primates and their allies. Still, Losaranaja had shown herself willing to try and work something out with James when it came to his continued participation in the council, even if she was most likely only doing so to keep the peace as much as she could. Now he would meet her and her son in her hotel, where they could hopefully hash out the necessary details. Most likely, once the conference was revived, he would once again be joining remotely, if he had to wager a guess. More had offered, or more precisely asked, to come along as well, in the obvious hopes to both make things a little less actively tense in the room through her presence, and possibly also to try and act as James's conscience a little bit, since it admittedly became harder and harder for him to really put himself into the mind of the many, many people who learned all that they knew about the situation through the news, meaning that he was gradually developing a shorter and shorter fuse with many of them each day, and more importantly each attempted attack on him, be it physical or verbal. And whenever that fuse ran especially short, more often reminded him that, while those people were wrong, the best way to show them that they were wrong most likely wasn't to act exactly how they expected him to act, that being aggressive and irrational. James, of course, still argued that being pushed so far that you acted out was in no way a confirmation for a natural tendency of acting out, but sadly that didn't count for much when you're a public figure. People were going to be stupid and jump to their conclusions, and if he didn't want to fan the flames, he would have to be better than himself here, at least for just a little while longer. But may the universe itself help anyone who would try to call him unreasonable for calling out this exact kind of behaviour in his opposition later. But of course they still would. Realising that he was getting into his own head, James took a few deep breaths. In and out. He was in control. Meanwhile, Moore also seemed to clearly see him troubling himself, and she slowly moved over to put one of her large clawed hands onto his back. "I know it may seem dire right now, but your efforts are not in vain, James," she assured him, while gently rubbing one large claw along his shoulders. "People will not be able to ignore that you are acting nothing but reasonable." James exhaled slowly, and for a moment he leaned into the touch, quite literally taking some weight off his shoulders, as Moore held him up for a second instead of his own strength. "I hope you're right," he said, with his eyes closed. Admittedly, he wasn't very hopeful. People had the incredible ability to only see what they wanted to see. He was no exception, of course, so maybe he only saw the worst of it right now for the very same reason. Still, even if he didn't share it himself, Moore's confidence was comforting in a way. "Of course, I am right," Moore encouraged him, as he stood up straight and began to walk on his own again, briefly patting against his back before pulling her fluffy arm away. "I have lived through it." James slightly grinned to himself at her words, feeling an ever so slight warmth in his chest. That warmth was, however, dampened again, when he suddenly heard Admir's voice speak up in front of him. "Oh, come on," he grumbled to himself over the line, causing James to glance up ahead to see what exactly had got him upset. Just up ahead of them was what seemed to be a sort of art installation, if it could be called that. It was a bit unclear, because many similar constructions had been recently popping up on the station over the last few days. However, usually, they were more of a memorial type. Just clean, but not exactly fancy, put-together stages, covered in black material and often hung with the pictures of many, if not all of the people who died during the attack. James has seen at least 6 of them on the station so far, with a new one popping up almost every day. And usually, they weren't anything to groan about. Again, they were memorials, opportunities for people to share and deal with their own and each other's pain, or paying tribute to those who died. In a quiet moment, they had all even met up with their old friends to visit one of them themselves, leaving small trinkets and flowers behind as a show of solidarity, and that they would not forget these victims either. However, this one was different. While the basic black stage-like structure remained, and the pictures of the fallen were still hung up on the back wall, the wall itself was less tasteful than the usual blank black canvas. Because this time, the backdrop was not painted in the black shades of grief. Instead, the rectangular wall was painted in the light blue hues of the flag of the human territories, with the white of the depictions of stars and heavenly bodies on it also poking through every now and then, although they could hardly be made out, because wherever one of the pictures was hung up, over the mockery of the flag, thick coats of paint in the respective colour of the blood of the victim's species was smeared over it, in big messy blotches. A flag, stained with the blood of its alleged victims. "How do they make this stuff so damn quickly?" Coco commented exasperatedly, and crossed her arms as she took in the sight. "Somebody probably already had it in the works," Amir replied back. However, his gaze seemed way less interested in the installation itself, and way more focused on the dense group of people crowding around and staring up at it. They would have to walk right past them. Great. The hotel was in sight already, and sadly, any detour large enough to really avoid the installation that was right in the middle of the large ground-level road would absolutely ensure that they would be way too late for their appointment. And, admittedly, James was kind of over it. "Let's just go," he said. At this point, he had seen his face plastered onto so many caricatures, mocking images and straight-up vile depictions of all kinds of acts, ranging from disturbing to straight-up absurd, that a mere desecration of humanity's flag really failed to move him at all. He wasn't even particularly attached to it, given that he had once voluntarily left the human territories behind. Whipping everyone out of their mixture of shock and exasperation by simply starting to move again, James soldiered on, determined to simply keep his gaze forwards, and power walk right past the display, while simultaneously simply ignoring any comments or other exclamations that may be directed his way from the crowd. Locking his eyes onto his destination of the hotel, he began his time march, tuning out the world around, up apart from any possible signs of danger. As he approached the sphere of influence of the macabre memorial, he was soon spotted by some of the people around it, who then quickly alerted the other people, which resulted in an audible cacophony of jeering and yells, all of which he ignored. By now, he had gotten surprisingly good at tuning out insults directed at him, especially when they came from a crowd, which was probably something that he would have to bring up with his therapist at some point. But right now, he would just take it over going insane from the constant onslaught of opposition. At least none of the people seemed to be quite frenzied enough to actually approach him or his company, being content with throwing their insults and accusations while he went by. And go by he did. Eyes forwards, feet walking, face neutral. And soon he was past it. That had gone well, for what it was worth at least. Again, not a single one of the insults had actually registered, which was good? He couldn't fully decide if it was, actually. It could be either good or very bad for his psyche in the long run, but at least right now it was good enough, as a sort of gap filler, until he could figure things out. Now he just needed to get to the hotel and... James! A loud call of his name suddenly derailed his complete one-track mind. Well, that and the hand on his shoulder pulling him around. He blinked as reality came rushing in over him like a crashing wave, and he stared blankly at the pixelated depiction of Admir's concerned facial expression for a second, before his eyes shot around quickly as he began to take in more of his surroundings again. There had to be a reason Admir had stopped him, and he had to find it. He had gotten a good bit past the crowd, so that probably wasn't it. Was somebody following them? No, nobody behind them. Anything in the way to the hotel? Nope, nothing there either. So it had to be something around... Oh. As he looked to the side, his gaze was immediately pulled upwards. And as his eyes slowly followed the shape of 4 giant bodies that had seemingly been standing next to him for a while, the scales in his mind definitely tipped towards his earlier trance not being a good thing, while he realized that his mind had somehow completely neglected to acknowledge them. And by the looks of things, it didn't seem like they had been super quiet or subtle or anything. The group consisted of 3 fuzzy Raphaelite and 1 large Estesai. All 4 giants had stopped maybe an arm's length, of their arms, not a human one, away from James's company, and they were intensely staring at Moore with emotionally charged faces. One of the 3 Raphaelite had bright fur and eyes, and especially deep notches in her horns. Another was basically the exact opposite, with quite dark fur and horns that seemed almost smooth in comparison. The last one, however, finally clued James into who these people basically had to be, because she looked like the exact image of Moore if she was a good couple of years younger. Immediately, he found himself reminded of some pictures she had shown him on occasion. These were her children, all 3 of them. And that meant that Ecstasy would have to be her daughter-in-law that caused such a stir for the old lady a long while ago, though in the meantime, they did figure things out between them from what he had heard. As her children stared at her, Moore stared right back. Shimmering wetness took hold of her eyes as she raised her arms in front of her mouth to hide her face, as her head swayed slightly so she could take each of their faces in. Her children seemed to be hesitant for a bit and kind of dragged their feet in place. However, then, finally, the bright 3rd one tried to speak up. If James wasn't mistaken, that was Kenta, Moore's oldest. "Hello, Mother. I know you may not want to..." she began to say. However, as soon as she had opened her mouth, Moore had not been able to stand still any longer, and immediately approached all of them with widely extended arms. Wrapping her long limbs around their necks, she pulled them all into an embrace, making sure to thoroughly clack and drag her larger horns at least once against each of theirs in the process. All the while, she made vocalizations that sounded like words broken up by sobbing. However, since she had switched to her native tongue as she spoke, James sadly understood very little of it, as he had barely picked up any words in the Raphaelite's general language over the time he had known Moore. However, whatever she may have been saying, to say that she sounded absolutely overjoyed was an absolute understatement. Her children all looked slightly awkward about being publicly cuddled like that. However, after who knew how long have only seen their mother through a screen at most, not one of them even writhed or wriggled in her embrace, simply rubbing their horns back against hers, while their eyes also visibly teared up. Standing awkwardly next to the touching scene, James wasn't quite sure if he should take it all in or if it would be rude to stare at it, and he should therefore gain a bit of distance from the display. As he briefly glanced around to see what the others seemed to think, he then noticed the Escalating, who had not quite joined in on the group hug, approaching him carefully. "Ambassador," she greeted, with a nod of her narrow head that showed off her much straighter and smoother horns in comparison to those of the Raphaelite. The colourful fuzz-like feathers covering her body, along with scales shimmered in purple, teal and turquoise colours. Her wide orange eyes looked down at him with an air of basic respect that he had missed in many others in recent times. "It is a pleasure to meet you. My name is Zarabi." James nodded, and did his best to keep his lips closed while smiling up at her. "Right, Muin's wife, correct?" he replied, hoping that he had not horribly misinterpreted her presence and identity. "It's a pleasure to meet you as well. I'm James." Zarabi laughed slightly, her goat-like face moving out in the motion. "I don't think the day that you will actually need to introduce yourself to someone again is not going to come anytime soon," she commented with a hint of sarcasm, to which James rubbed his head. She probably wasn't wrong, but he much preferred it for the people he talked to hear his name out of his mouth, instead of letting them keep whatever version of him they had been introduced to through other means. "It's good to stay polite," he deflected her comment, not wanting to get too deeply into his thoughts right now. "Anyway, what brings you to this station?" Zarabi looked a bit concerned, and momentarily averted her gaze to look at the still ongoing display of affection next to them. Briefly, she cleared her throat. "The news, I'm afraid," she then confided, still not meeting his gaze again. James raised an eyebrow in mild confusion, wondering for only a moment why the recent news would entice anyone to visit this place. However, as he then followed her gaze at the hugging family, he immediately understood. Honestly, he didn't know why he hadn't known immediately. "Oh," he mumbled, and felt a knot start to form in his stomach. Apparently catching some of the conversation, Moore's ears twitched briefly before she finally let go of her children and turned in Zarabi's direction. Noticing herself now being in the old lady's sights, Zarabi swallowed again. "Hello, Mrs. Bistrai," she greeted with another bow of her head. "Zarabi," Moore replied, and turned to approach her daughter-in-law with her long arms extended forwards. Her voice was full of deep emotion. "Let me look at you." She reached for the Esther's face, gently bringing her clawed hands to the younger woman's cheeks, while she studied her face thoughtfully, her eyes still constantly tearing. Then, with a sound of pure, uncontained joy, Moore pulled Zarabi into a hug as well. "You are so beautiful," Moore let out between huffing breaths, while she held her son's wife in her arms for the first time. "Finally, I can truly welcome you to the family." Zarabi returned Moore's hug, hesitantly, although James could hear that her breathing also got heavier, as she was faced with this overwhelming acceptance. Behind Moore, he could also see the dark-furred Raphaelite, which had to be Muin, discreetly wipe over his eyes with the long fur of his arm, as he tried to contain his own emotions at the scene. However, while he was watching all of that, James suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder again. James?" Coco said, and waited for him to turn his head to look at her. Once he did, she lifted her arm at an angle, and tapped at her wrist with her index finger. Right. The time. They were already late. Damn it. James looked at the hotel, then back at the touching scene, then back at the hotel. Fuck, this was bad timing. Finally overcoming an inner barrier, he then quickly turned towards his destination. Crap, gotta run, he announced loudly enough that Moore and all her children could hear while he began to book it in the hotel's direction. More quietly through their shared communications, he then added towards Admir and Coco. I'll be fine on the inside and we'll keep my comms open. You keep an eye on things here, alright? And with that, he was off, hauling ass to maybe somehow barely make it, so he was just slightly late. With a grunt of sheer frustration, Sheeta would have loved to slam the door to the hive room she just came out of behind her, if only it had been physically possible. She had spent the last couple of however long it had been, once more trying her very best to convince a very uncooperative Kwafwem and his people that it would be a really damn good idea to cooperate with humanity, who were not only Dunamir's closest military allies right now, but also literally the only ones not planning to possibly wipe a large chunk of it off the galactic map, in a mere attempt to somehow get rid of a Veselon, during the investigations of this false flag incident that had not only incriminated humanity, but Miat kind as well. However, the old idiot wasn't budging, seemingly convinced that he would somehow manage to pull his head out of this noose, while also leaving humanity to hang. She could have torn her own hair out. It was so frustrating. Surely the fool couldn't still rely on whatever contacts he had once that had brought him into his current position. Clearly they weren't interested anymore. At least not all was lost, as they could obviously still relatively comfortably rely on Zishidi's support. But sadly, even with the second largest Komautopenno on their side, it wasn't quite the same as having the major political force of government working with them. The Miat military guards that had been stationed on either side of Kwafwem's current temporary abode out of necessary safety concerns of the current situation, looked at her with expressions that ranged from somewhat sympathetic to absolutely ridiculing. She managed to ignore them for the most part as she stormed past, running her hands through her hair while grabbing onto it, lightly enough that it would drag slowly through her fingers, as she tried to calm herself down with a few breathing exercises. Walking along the top of the hive, she was soon joined by Nia, Tuya and Sam, whom she had asked to please wait for her outside while she tried to talk some sense into her conspecifics. Kwafwem always seemed to make a game out of things as soon as humans were present, and so she preferred it to have the intimacy of getting to personally stare him down indefinitely as soon as he tried to derail the conversation. Not that that made the conversation any more fruitful in the end, but at least it made it shorter. "No luck again?" Nia asked her with a soft but reassuring smile that was most likely meant to remind her that this was nothing new, more so than it was meant to cheer her up. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," Sheeta hissed through her teeth, while putting her hands behind her head to give herself an overly casual demeanour, despite her frustration. "The guy's just an ass." She said that well within the earshot of the guards behind her, of course, and she did not care one bit. "Well, props that you keep on trying," Tuya commented, and heavily patted Sheeta's shoulder with a flat hand. "I wouldn't have your patience." Sheeta scoffed. "That has got to be the first time anyone has ever said that to me unironically," she replied, both earnestly amused and slightly flattered. "Well, it's not exactly a high bar," Sam teased, though her tone as she did it was so dry that it would have been hard to tell that she was being facetious if everyone around hadn't known her quite so well. At the very least, Tuya herself could laugh about it, so that was probably the most important thing. As they all turned to possibly return to their own rooms, Tuya suddenly looked up, slightly, her gaze gliding in the direction of the closest stair, leading up to the roof and the ground level. As Sheeta looked in the same direction, she saw the odd sight of two Rushgak soldiers, walking at either side of two much smaller people that huddled together in between the insectoid Deathworlders. They were clearly amphibious, and about the size of a medium dog, although they held their bodies much closer to the ground. The white fish eyes atop their flat heads looked around nervously and formed a stark contrast to their otherwise quite colourful bodies. Their slightly mottled skins were a dark teal and a heavy pink respectively, with the exception of the large, membranous wings growing out of their sides. Although they weren't entirely opened, with the skin throwing deep wrinkles as they folded up, you could still see the colourful red, blue, black and orange patterns that were almost butterfly-like in nature displayed on them. Sheeta narrowed her eyes at them. Although they seemed rather timid and fearful, as they held onto each other with one of their short arms and half-extended wings, something felt off about them that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Someone's out of their element, Tuya commented on the site, once she had noticed that everyone else was looking at them as well. Those are Terravelt, Nia commented, having snapped up quite a few of the galactic species while she helped James with his memory training to learn about all of them. They're pretty sensitive, so I guess it's pretty scary for them being on a Deathworlder station and walking into a Deathworlder hive. Sheeda furrowed her brow a bit. Those were Terravelt? Sure, but then why are they walking into it? Sam wondered aloud, and crossed her arms as she observed the strange scene as well. Not like there's any ways leading through this place that one would have to take for anything. Maybe they know one of the participants, Nia suggested, although based on their demeanour, it seems somewhat unlikely that either of them would be close friends with any kind of Deathworlder. Once they had made it completely onto the roof of the hive, they looked around. Still flanked by the two Rushgak soldiers, they scanned over the entire roof for a moment. However, as soon as the teal-coloured one's eyes fell onto the group of uniformed Deathwarders staring back at them, they excitedly perked up and poked their companion, gaining their attention quickly before insistently pointing in Sheeda's direction. The other one followed the pointing finger, and also perked up, once their eyes had met with Sheeda's face. Oh, this just couldn't be good at all.